So let's look at the third way of assessing validity, which I call criterion validity. For me, I mean by criterion validity assessments that correlate the measurements made with one instrument with other measurements of similar or dissimilar constructs. So either similar and related constructs, then we want a high correlation, or dissimilar unrelated constructs, then we want a low correlation. There is conceptions of criterion validity that don't consider the dissimilar or unrelated constructs as part of criterion validity. Just you aren't confused. The more established the other measurement instrument is, and the more well established the expected relationship, the stronger would be the criterion validity test. So let's look into the different kinds of criterion validity testing. So what we want is usually a positive and strong correlation between measures that would then indicate high validity. If we want positive and strong correlation, we call this validity testing convergent validity, concurrent validity, or predictive validity. We'll look at this table in a second that shows you which is which. And if we want a negative, a null, or at best a weak positive correlation, and that would point towards validity, then we call this discriminant validity. So if we try to systematize that, we can look at correlations between a gold standard measure, let's say a complex intelligence test with lots of different test items, and our new scale that we measure along with the gold standard measure at the same time. Right? So we have the IQ test and the long IQ test and the short one. And if we have a high correlation, that would mean, okay, I can basically substitute the long and complex test with the simple one, which would be good. That's called convergent validity. The same goes for when it's just some alternative measure. So you have two relatively equally popular intelligence tests and check whether they converge. That means there's a high correlation between the scores the two produce in the data. And if that is the case, we also say there is convergent validity. However, when we think that things are correlated, so they are not the different measures of the same construct, but they are just correlated empirically. They are two distinct constructs that, however, have something to do with each other. We call this concurrent validity if it occurs at the same time, or predictive validity if first comes the measurement of our concept and then we measure a likely outcome at a later time. Right? So both, if we don't know the causal direction, we call it concurrent validity. If what we measure is the possible cause and what we compare it with is the possible outcome, we call it concurrent validity if it's measured at the same time, or predictive validity if the cause is measured before the outcome, in line with the time lag you want to have between cause and effect. And if we measure the outcome and compare it with a possible cause, then we also call it concurrent validity. So it's only about the nomenclature, it's only about the time point of the two measurements, not about their role here as correlate, antecedent, or outcome. Good. And the final one is that we also want to demonstrate that our measurement isn't the same as some other measurement of another construct. That means we want low correlations or even negative correlations, but also not strong negative correlations, then we would call that looking for discriminant validity. Because if there is a high negative correlation, that is basically just as strong a connection as a high positive correlation, just in the opposite direction. So if you reverse the two scores, suddenly you have a positive correlation and then no discriminant validity. Good. And the roots of criterion validity problems, there's no specific thing about them. They are just the same things that can cause poor reliability or poor phase validity. Let's look at an example. Imagine you want to assess journalists' job performance in a news outlet. And there we look at 4 different measures that we compare and want to kind of learn what these measures do. One is a self-assessment by the journalist who in a questionnaire expresses themselves, how good is my job performance from my point of view. Then we have a quite robust performance test using an assessment center. Or we have a supervisor's assessment using a questionnaire, so we don't ask the journalists themselves to assess themselves, but their supervisors to assess them. Or we look at the salary of the journalists from a database, so kind of assuming a higher performance might be indicated by higher salaries. And lastly, we content analyze the writing of the journalists using stylometrics. Because that's probably the least known and immediately understandable of the different measures. Let's look at the stylometrics in a bit more detail. We want to validate this against these other measures or correlates of job performance, and the bold claim we are investigating might be, instead of conducting complicated assessment centers or requiring supervisor assessments, we could just calculate the flash reading ease score. That probably your boss has this idea that you could simply use that, and you are investigating whether that's true. And the reading ease score is a bit dated, and it tries to express this in terms of years of education or so, for which this would be a typical score. So you have fixed numbers of 207 approximately, and from that you deduct slightly weighted average sentence length. So the number of words divided by the number of sentences in the articles that a person writes, and subtract roughly 85 times the rate of number of words by the number of syllables by the number of words. So do you use long words? Then it's a difficult writing style, and if you use long sentences, then it's also a more difficult writing style. Okay? So higher scores mean it's easier to understand. Good. And we measure these things at 2 different times, though only the salary is measured at time 2 as well. And this is the so-called correlation matrix, saying like a style self-assessment, or a self-assessment by the journalist is correlated with itself perfectly at 1, and 0.49 with the assessment center, 0.61 with the supervisor assessment, 0.15 with the salary at 0.1, and 0.17 at time 2, this is a typo, and 0.48 with the stylometric score, the flash score. Okay? So this is how to read this table. And now we can investigate the different sorts of validity. Convergent validity, remember, it's testing against alternative measures, either the gold standard or just some alternative measure. And we there usually want a correlation of 0.70 to say this has convergent validity. Of course, this is gradual, so the more the better, but 0.70 is a common borderline to draw between. Yeah, this is kind of sufficient for saying this has convergent validity. The gold standard could be the assessment center score in this case, against which we evaluate the flash reading ease score. So let's look up stylometrics and assessment center. It's 0.35. So 0.35 means there is some positive correlation, but way too little to really view the measurement as validated. Okay, so it's far below 0.70. Not a good measure that could just replace the assessment center, you would say. Or we use an alternative measure, maybe look at supervisor assessment of job performance. There we find a correlation of 0.38. So that's also not very impressive. Our initial skepticism that this measure could replace the assessment center or the supervisor assessment seems to prove true. So you can tell your boss, no, we can't just let go of the more complicated measurements. It's something else. It's correlated, but weakly so. Or only moderately so. Good. Let's look at the third, second category, concurrent validity. So we check the correlations with possibly related constructs, and because we don't expect the different scores to be the same, but only to be positively related or somehow related, we have a different standard here. R greater than 0.30 may indicate some concurrent or predictive validity. So looking at a likely correlate, we might just correlate the stylometrics with the self-assessment of one's writing style in terms of writing in a clear, concise, plain style. That's what we ask the journalists to rate. Do you write in a clear, concise, plain style? And they rate this, say, on a 10-point scale. And here we observe R equals 0.48. So that is quite some correlation, and we see that stylometrics and this writing in a clear, concise, plain style also should be related. We have a substantial positive correlation, and that would say we have some concurrent validity. If we think that the writing style shapes your self-image of yourself as a writer, that would be some support for this, and if you know that this relationship exists, you would say then this flash reading ease score seems to be a valid measure of writing simplicity, writing style simplicity, that then affects the self-image of the journalist. And therefore, it can be viewed as a validation of this measure. And we can also view it as a likely outcome. Can stylometrics predict salary? At the same time, 0.31 is the correlation we find. Journalists with a plainer style seem to earn more, but the relationship is relatively weak, or at best moderate in strength. However, if we use the 0.30 as a rough criterion, then we can say there is some concurrent validity. If we know that simple language that you use leads to higher salaries, then we get the impression that the flash reading ease score is actually capturing the simplicity of the writing style. And we can also try to predict the salary at the second time point, and there the R is even lower, so it's not really a very good predictor, and our predictive validity is kind of not very high, so this doesn't strongly suggest that this is a good measure of the reading ease. However, at least there is a positive correlation and it's not too close to zero, so it depends in that case very much on how strong you expect the relationship to be between writing style and salary. Finally, discriminant validity. Is this writing ease score something different than a thing we want it not to measure or not to reflect? The correlation between the measure and the measure of a construct it should be different from should not exceed R equals 0.1 and also not minus 0.1, so it should hover around 0. The stylometric measure is not sufficiently distinct from any of the other measures to be sure that they measure distinct concepts. So if you look at all these numbers, they are all relatively high or higher than you would want it than to say this has nothing to do with supervisor assessment, style self-assessment, assessment center score, or salary. And so it's not, if we wanted to discriminate it from these other measures and concepts, then our discriminant validity test would have failed. Okay.